Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we're going to be bringing back an old series called 10 Flaws, where we look at Star Wars ships, vehicles, and faction designs and analyze their shortcomings. Check out the entire 10 Flaws playlist in the top right corner if you're interested in seeing more videos like this. The CR-70 Consular Class Cruiser is one of the first starships we see in Star Wars if we are going by chronological order. In a way, this Republic frigate is like the CR-90 Corvette of the prequel era, built for a similar purpose and used by similar individuals with a similar mission. The first version of the CR-70 Consular Cruiser entered service shortly after the Rusan Reformation, somewhere around 1990 BBY. The leaders of the Republic had quite optimistically promised a future for the galaxy that was without violence, destruction, or chaos. The Consular Class Cruiser was one of the first government ships built during this time and exemplified the spirit of this reformed galactic republic. Used by the government's diplomats, senators, and other important officials, the Consular Class Cruiser was completely unarmed and unable to defend itself from enemy fire. Post-New Sith Wars, the Republic Navy and its Jedi leaders had been completely disbanded, meaning that these cruisers oftentimes had to travel the hyperspace lanes without a federal escort. Occasionally, a local defense force might accompany their mission, but they usually had a very limited and restrictive jurisdiction in which they could operate. Even though the elite lawmakers in the Galactic Center felt like peace was attainable in their time, it was clearly a whole other story on the fringes of the galaxy. The red paint on the Consular Class Cruiser's hull signified the diplomatic immunity an agent of the Republic would have. The same paint would also later be used on Jedi fighters and later on Venator-class Star Destroyers. Now, these Republic agents could signify as much as they wanted on how they were neutral and not to be harmed, but how pirates and corporate overlords reacted to them really depended on the situation. Not having weapons on a ship of this size and importance is completely naive. It also limited a diplomat's options when it came to accomplishing their missions or going through a negotiation. This was not even a normal thing for other civilian ships, which most certainly would have been heavily armed if traversing through the more wild areas of the galaxy. Of course, not every Consular Class Cruiser was used for diplomatic purposes. These ships were officially run by the Judicial Department, who were sort of a federal police, who now were also given additional duties now that the federal military was gone. While the Senate and the Chancellors had their own guard, the Judicials would actually ferry them around in such ships, but there were also special Consular Class Cruisers that were also modified for combat duty. This meant that they were oftentimes used as light assault cruisers and also frigates, as well as troop transports. But this wasn't because the Consular Class Cruiser was flexible in its design, it was more a result of the Republic's limited military budget. The Jedi were said to have chosen this ship primarily because of its very utilitarian nature. This means that this ship was clearly designed for civilians and used civilian quality materials. So even if you do install military upgrades to its frame, the Consular Class Cruiser was more a Toyota Helix than, say, an infantry fighting vehicle. Doesn't matter how many Kevlar inserts you put inside the door panels, you probably are not going to survive that battle if it gets too hairy. Even when the ship was converted for military duty, it still lacked the right armament for the job it was required to do. Prior to the Clone Wars, a CR-70 Republic frigate was usually armed with only 4 turbolasers and 2 concussion missile launchers. This was a ship that was 115 meters in length, yet armed like a much smaller gunship. It also lacked point defense weapons, which were usually used to fend off enemy starfighters. These would have been relatively easy upgrades to make to the CR-70. After all, this was a Corellian engineering corporation ship. They usually had a massive aftermarket and also plenty of docking points for bolt-ons. With the start of the Clone Wars, Project Supercharger was started by the Republic's Defense Procurement Office. At the Battle of Geonosis, the Republic military lacked a true escort fleet for its acclimator assault ships and had to rely on just snub fighters and corvettes. The Charger CR70 Retrofit, as it was called, included additional armor and also weapons emplacements. Now you'd imagine a diplomatic cruiser like this, which is unarmed and has a blockade-style engine orientation, would be ridiculously fast. But the CR70 could travel at only around 900 kilometers in atmosphere. While this might be a bit above average for your typical civilian ship, it was slower than most starfighters and patrol ships, many of which could top out at over 1,200 kilometers per hour. The Charger CR70 retrofits were installed with larger engines, which did increase the speed substantially, but these were usually not used for diplomatic missions. Even if a Consular Class Cruiser was able to make it to hyperspace, its 2.0 class hyperdrive was undersized and underpowered, especially when you consider that many Republic and Rebel Alliance ships had a Class 1.5 or even a Class 1 hyperdrive, as did many larger ships of the line. If your enemy could somehow trace your trajectory once you jumped, they could definitely reach your destination before you could. For a ship of its size, the Consular Class Cruiser had a pretty small crew. This usually was made up of a captain, a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a comms officer, and about 3 or 4 technicians. Consular Class Cruisers were sometimes equipped with as few as 2 crew members, a pilot and a co-pilot. Without a weapons officer or engineer on board, they would be at a serious disadvantage in a major battle. It was said that the crew number was kept low for security reasons. The less crew members you had on, the less people you had to screen in case someone important like Palpatine came aboard. I would argue that most likely this is more due to the Judicial's lacking manpower and funding. While most civilian ships do run skeleton crews in order to save costs, especially long-range haulers, it becomes a huge liability to have such a large ship be so understaffed, especially one that attracts unwanted attention with its paint job. The CR-90 Corvette, which was used during the rise of the Empire and Galactic Civil War period, usually had a minimal crew of 46 and up to 165 depending on the mission. It wasn't significantly larger than the Consular Class Cruiser at 150 meters in length. A skeleton crew usually means that each crew member has more responsibilities, and overall the ship becomes less efficient and less responsive. The Consular Class Cruiser also lacked ample space for its passengers. It could only fit 16 to 24 individuals depending on the configuration of the ship. This was largely due to the fact that the Consular Class Cruiser featured luxurious staterooms with thick walls and insulation for privacy instead of the bunk-style common sleeping areas most military ships had. This again points to the fact that this ship was most likely designed first for civilian use rather than military use. But still, the Republic would use this ship occasionally as a troop transport, making it one of the least efficient transports of its size. Now, the CR-70 was able to function with such a small crew because the majority of its systems were automated or basically maintained by droids. While this was seen as a significant advantage and cost-saving measure, for a ship that could encounter battle, it was a liability. Especially because pirates and raiders are more likely to try to stop this ship and then board it and take it over rather than to destroy it. These type of enemies would oftentimes use overpowered ion projectiles, which could take a ship offline for several minutes or hours and not damage or kill anyone inside. This is why most ships featured large engineering departments so that they could quickly repair or replace any damaged components. If the crew is mostly made out of droids, you're going to have a significant problem because they'll all be knocked out by the ion blast. Droids also tend to be unnoticed in Star Wars, meaning it would be relatively easy to sneak aboard a spy or some other malicious actor in the guise of a maintenance droid. Despite the important type of cargo this ship carries around, it had a surprisingly few number of escape pods. Well, there was actually 3, but there were 2 standard ones midship, and then there was a larger salon pod beneath the bridge. The salon pod had multiple purposes. They were heavily armored and sealed from probing and bugging, and were appointed for serious negotiations and diplomacy. The salon pod also served as a common room for the rest of the ship, and in an extreme situation could even be jettisoned off the ship as another escape pod. This large room could hold around a dozen people, but was quite bulky and lacked any real maneuverability or defenses, which meant it was a pretty easy target for an enemy force. Ideally, a ship like the Consular class would have more individual escape pods, making it difficult for the enemy to destroy or seize all of the survivors of the battle. Now, whenever a vehicle or a ship enters combat for the first time, any major design issues will immediately be noticed by either the crew, if they survive, or by the officers in charge of the after-action report. Usually within months, if not weeks, quick fixes and modifications will immediately be implemented, along with a longer list for the manufacturers to implement at the production level. The Consular Class Cruiser, however, had 2 larger issues that could not easily be altered by some clip-on mods. First, the bridge was located in a precarious location at the head of the ship and slightly jutting out. As a matter of fact, some people might be reminded of an Ithorian's head and neck area. The Ithorians were not known for their fighting ability, they were slow, lethargic, and if I'm being completely honest, they were extremely boring as well. This type of bridge might be useful for a freighter, which requires more visibility when performing complicated docking procedures, but on a combat ship, this was a massive liability. The bridge should be in the most protected area of the ship, ideally somewhere in the middle of the body, and it most certainly should not be placed on a raised platform. Even if an enemy captain has never seen a Corellian ship before, it's pretty obvious where he should attack for the maximum amount of damage. Then there was the large cluster of communication antennas and satellites that sat at the top of the ship right before the engines. The shield generator was also nestled there and relatively unprotected. One direct hit in that area from an enemy turbo laser and the ship would not only lose its communications, it would also lose its shields. Now, if the Consular Class Cruiser was designed only for the civilian market, I probably would have left it alone. Most Corellian ships are, after all, designed as blank slates that an owner can modify any way they want to. But as a military ship or a transport, the Consular Class Cruiser needed to be more specialized and better designed for battle. I consider the ship as more of a stopgap measure rather than an actual military ship. It's amazing that the Republic used this cruiser for more than 1,000 years. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.